Hello, I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP, and first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video, and subsequently visiting my channel. The topic of this video will be on extroverted intuition and introverted intuition. What I primarily want to cover in this video, though I've talked about intuition in a general sense prior to this, is regarding a question that a viewer was asking me about my ideas of the nature of extroverted intuition versus the nature of introverted intuition. This question stems by way of their issue and concern with another analyst's opinion on the nature of introverted intuition being not as metaphysical as some would believe it to be, and that the basis for the INFJ's metaphysical nature stems from the polar extroverted intuition that exists in their subconscious rather than the active functioning of introverted intuition. At least if I'm understanding this argument correctly, that's what they posit. And they posit that extroverted intuition is the metaphysical agent and introverted intuition is the copying or licensing agent. But one thing I have to say is that initially the issue I take with this is the fact that the streams of thought for one or the other, and I'll say this before I continue, this will start from the general sense and then recede into the specific sense as I typically like to present arguments, but the nature of the two functions is such that one is divergent and licensing in its creations and associations. The other is convergent and singular in its associations and constructions and conclusions. It's the case that extroverted intuition is one of a dynamic, spinning, and multiplicative nature. It's the case that it legitimately works the world out in probabilistic models with causal lines and strands of association, much like the items of a tree, which is a mathematical model. It starts from one node, then diverges into several other branching patterns in nodes of association and connectivity. It's the case that introverted intuition does the reverse. It starts from multiple strands and nodes and regresses into one singular point. The reason I mention this is to say the problem with the analyses is that I think oftentimes people view symptoms and assume that symptoms are the etiology or the reason for, or they use symptoms to confuse they use ubiquitous or universal or shared symptoms of a given phenomenon or behavior and assume necessarily the same etiology. And what I mean by that is this, that if an extroverted intuitive type holds metaphysical propositions and precepts, they're holding it for a different reason than the introverted intuitive type. It's not to say that extroverted intuitive individuals cannot hold their own viewpoints on metaphysical precepts, but typically there is another function motivating them to look towards the shamanic and archetypal expressions of reality, primarily if you're talking about the ENFP or the INFP, that has more to do with the introverted feeling in them than it does the extroverted intuition. But if you're talking about an ENTP or an INTP, it's the case that it might be their own innate disposition to view something from a singular standpoint and principal basis for the I would say evidence for them to believe in absolute truth, or the a principle anchoring substance in terms of a monotheistic belief. I know that that's the case for a lot of INTPs or ENTPs that are religious, that it's the fact that religion offers them the basis to formulate things from a seed of absolute truth and inerrant truth, that they subscribe to such a belief in terms of their motivational landscape, even if they might not agree with that analysis. That's, at least from my perspective, what I view. Now, what I'll say is that extroverted intuition's nature is philosophically skeptical. It says that there are multiple reasons, there are multiple potential arguments for why a thing has occurred. And since there are multiple arguments or potential arguments for why a thing could occur, what function or purpose it serves, its reason for being, or why I'm seeing it in the way that I'm seeing it, or understanding it in the way that I'm understanding it, I must be presented with a sufficient amount of data points that satisfy the introverted sensing orientation of myself to curb my ideation and attention to this thing, this one strand of argument, or this one potential line of cause being the thing that I trumpet or hold true overall. And it's the case that when you're talking about an INTP or an ENTP, they must have this satisfied not only by the data sets, but by the mechanisms of their own self-referential and fairly scrutinizing and rigorous logic. And it's the case with the INFP or the ENFP. It must appeal to their value structures and the moral and ethical precepts that they hold true as an individual. And it's the case that the dominant thing that you can understand about extroverted intuition's nature is that its flavor is skepticism rather than being a metaphysician. It's certainly concerned about the nature of reality, but its issue with the nature of reality is the multiplicity that potentially arises from the fact that there is too many ways that you can associate, link, and demonstrate the connectivity amongst things, but not in any, because of its divergent nature, not in any way that brings you certainty of one strand of argument or cause or said pattern for a thing over another. It's perceptually based like that, and it sees two sides to the coin at the very minimum always. And if an extroverted intuitive type believes in something of a broader sense, it's because there's been some sort of argument that's convinced them that's appealing to their judgment function, and or they just hold it in suspension to try it out, essentially, to see, or to act it out to see if it's true or not. But they won't dismiss the idea or of this or that if there's not sufficient evidence to do so. It's rather open-ended, and they keep the possibility there just in case it shows itself to be useful for whatever purposes of whatever judging function that they have. Now, with that said, I'll turn to introverted intuition. And it's the case that it is fundamentally metaphysical in its orientation, from the standpoint that it is looking to make a line of cause and effect for the whys of reality. It's the case that introverted intuition is I should say something like the, I'll just turn to Newton and say that it's far more empirical and certain of its conclusions than extroverted intuition and introverted sensing are. For the mere fact that introverted intuition and extroverted sensing are a part of the same functional axes, it's the case that the introverted intuitive type is going to be looking for the why for what it sees, what it tastes, what it experiences, and what it can make out from the pluralism and extremely visceral and poignant aspects of reality. Introverted intuition has to synthesize these experiences, observations, realizations, for the mere fact that if, the reason that Newton was able to take the leap that the same force governs the apple falling from the tree as it does the celestial bodies is because Newton has the ability to see that, as it falls, it rotates slightly. What's causing it to rotate? It's obviously its shape and certain types of inertia, but as it falls, it doesn't stay uniformed in its motion. And it's also the case that whenever you observe the planets over a long period of time, they have it such that they displace, not drastically, but they displace in kind of a not and their axes shift over time. And Newton was aware of these observations that were made by Tycho Brahe and Kepler, and he can see that, I have to, if I'm looking at why these things are impacting me and the world, and they produce something of a similar nature in their overall empirical makeup from what I can clearly observe, there has to be something underlying, there has to be an underlying why for the mechanism. And they are metaphysicians because they it's of a metaphysical flavor in bit because it's always looking to prescribe a why. Extroverted intuition is looking to prescribe a why, but it's not certain of any for whom or why, to where introverted intuition is completely okay with making leaps because and it doesn't see itself as making leaps, but its epiphanies, insights, and revelations, the complete revelatory nature of it makes it such that the items for the introverted intuitive type come with striking clarity and certainty. That's for whatever reason, for whatever neurological reason, that's what characterizes a eureka moment or an intuitive insight, according to the literature in cognitive science. And it's also the case that introverted intuition, from a Jungian standpoint, is the thing that cares to look only. There's only two functions that care to look at the anthropomorphic landscape and what constitutes the collective unconscious, and that would be introverted intuition and introverted feeling. And it's the case that because introverted intuition is archetypally generative, meaning that it is the very function within the human psyche that tends to generate archetypes, or tends to collect the overall impression of all things and lay them on top of one another and sort of sew them to a whole. It's Plato who came up with the idea of ideal forms. That wasn't Einstein, and that wasn't Einstein, that wasn't Feynman. That's not something you're going to necessarily find the skeptic being quick to assume or buy into necessarily. But the reason that of course Plato didn't know everything about the world, know all the things that we know about the world now, or in the time of Feynman or Einstein, empirically that they did, or that we do. But it's also the case that they tend to ascend. Well, it tends to, not they in terms of INFJs, but introverted intuitive types in general tend to have a dualistic nature to their psyche, where they tend to want to try and make a kind of sense in harmony from from the standpoint of a psychological anchor and substrate of narratives. Like the narrative substrate seems to be the dictum for their ideation, and it's the case that it's the reason for the theory of mind. It's the case that it's looking to invert and whittle, or I suppose sculpt and mold the very strong and literal sensory impressions it gets about the world and its observation into something that's actually palatable. It's synthetic in its operations, to where extroverted intuition is not like that. And it's the case that it's synthetic in its observation because extroverted sensings, or at least it works like this in the INTJ and the INFJ. Well, and it does like this to some extent in the ENFJ and the ENTJ. Extroverted sensing represents chaos. It represents chaos. It's the fact that there is just this pluralism in complete meaninglessness or there's this potential complete meaninglessness to all activity. It seems rather punctuated and random. And for one to be able to see, I guess, the forest instead of the trees, one has to kind of make a mental representation or a construct or a map or module, but it's the case that you have to take in superimpose some structure in order on all of the disparate conclusions for you to ever be able to synthesize it into some whole. It's the case that they try to catch things and wed them together. It's the case that they do catch things and wed them together. That's introverted intuition's bent. And it's the case that for the most part, in terms of what's really influencing its interest in conclusions are the why for people, and the INFJ are the why for the phenomenological nature of reality and aspects of life, and in the INTJ in terms of the nature of reality and the why for what's moving in the world and in the world of people. I mean, that's just it. Just they care to be sleuths about how things, the why or the underlying mechanism to things, and it's the case that that's the nature of introverted thinking, and that's the nature of introverted intuition, and the functions aren't the same. I mean, well, not in the, well, obviously, but I think obviously the functions aren't the same because they have different names or different identities. So that's apparent, but there's a real trend in the movement of analyses that I'm observing, and that I think many of my viewers are observing, where we're tarnishing the lines, and it's the sense, and and I get the sense that it's the case that we think we can make whatever we want out of a function or mode of being. It's the case that there is a sort of an insidious bent into the destruction of the categories of things in ways that don't make sense. That I'll say this about trying to be ingenious or original in one's analyses. It's the case that whatever you come up with, it can be original, but it also has to be accurate, and it has to be useful. It's the case that if you come up with any conclusion about something, and you don't cross-reference it with whatever is already established within Jungian typology, and you don't cross-reference it with at least some statistics that can be gathered from cognitive science, affective neuroscience, and neuroscience, you are not being thorough, and you're not being accurate. I mean, maybe you can get something that's the case, but I beg you not to do that when you're trying to be original. When you're trying to be original, you have to reference reality to some extent. You have to do it to some extent, and you can't make up whatever you wish to make up for whatever agenda you might have. It's not the case that your position as, I mean, I know why many people are on YouTube and making videos, and it's not the case that it's in the name of whatever is true or whatever is accurate, but I mean, I think that if anybody wants it such that somebody can view these things and find them helpful or useful, they have to be accurate, and it has to be the case that the whole construct of typology can't be a purely abstract exercise, because it's not the case that that's what Jung intended it for in the first place. But it should be the case that people can reference, you know, and I get that typology isn't necessarily an academic domain, but I do think that intellectual integrity is imperative to any kind of pursuit or venture, and it's the case that if you are not willing to follow, well, I don't know, but it's just this: you shouldn't give out ideas to people that are wrong or that are errant. That's dangerous, because people, I mean, not everybody's interested in ideas for the sake of ideas, and it's the case that most people want to use the ideas for their benefit in terms of understanding themselves or acting some way in the world. And it's not the case that you can act in the world with falsehoods, I mean, or just bad analysis. I mean, that doesn't work. And I always, at least, I don't always, but I say it's like this, that, you know, you could analogize it to something like this. You have a 4-year-old kid, and you tell them that every Sunday morning there's a magical ice cream truck that comes right up the street that sells the best ice cream of their lives that they could imagine for 25 cents a pop. And so that kid asks you, really? And you say, yeah, it comes every Sunday. I promise you it comes every Sunday. Or at least it's my perspective that it comes every Sunday. The kid would like some ice cream, or the kid would like to get themselves some sugar. And so they wake up every morning and they look for this ice cream truck, and they think that, oh, I just missed it. Because that's what most people think. It's not the case that most people think that that person lied to me, or that the person doesn't know what the hell that they're talking about. Usually, unless they are skeptical of and thinking of some nature, but most people aren't. And I mean, like, I know it's not anyone's responsibility to be accountable for the laziness and critical thinking and the ignorance of most people, but it's the case too that you shouldn't be a charlatan. I mean, like, that's for real. You shouldn't intentionally or willfully lie to people in terms of your presentation of information. And it's the case that, I mean, just that ice cream truck stands for meaning, or that ice cream truck stands for truth or knowledge or something else. And I believe that it's morally wrong to take and infringe on somebody's pursuit of knowledge, meaning, or truth. I mean, even if the truth is you don't know, or it's just your thought or whim, be accurate in at least in your qualifiers, in your descriptions. I mean, just say it's an interesting idea or something like that, but don't go changing the well-established and logical notions of a thing just because you got your own agenda, or you want to be interesting or engaging. I mean, the name of the game in creativity, well, I mean, like, there's different kinds of creativity, I'll just say that. And the name of the game in descriptive creativity is to describe the nature of reality. And if you're going to be in the business of trying to describe the nature of reality, which is what you're doing when you're talking about how somebody actually is or how something exists, Because when you're talking about those things, you're talking about cognition, people's brains, and how they actually function and think and act in the world, and how they're motivated to be. I mean, it doesn't get any more real than that. That's psychology. And if you're going to get into the business of it, you should at least try to be accurate. You should at least try to be accurate. Or read something, or do something else besides just listening to what everybody else says on YouTube and being an armchair intellectual. I mean, do better than that. But I digress. Anyway, that's my video on the nature of extroverted intuition and introverted intuition. And it's the case that it can be well demonstrated that introverted intuitive types are otherworldly. They're metaphysicians, and they're not necessarily grounded in the now. They oftentimes don't even feel like they have a body, or that it even makes sense to honor the damn thing. And yeah, I mean, ENTPs and INTPs may forget to take care of themselves, but it's not the case that it's the case that we can have ideas about metaphysical aspects and the nature of reality, but it tends to be the case that ENTPs, INTPs, even ENFPs and INFPs tend to be worldly. They tend to be worldly in their disposition, even if they believe things about other worlds, or spiritual, or metaphysical systems. Because the reason why the ENFP and the INFP believe that thing in the now, because they believe it has benefit right now. And if it didn't have significant value to them in terms of their life in an immediate sense, they would not bother with it. They would not bother with it at all. They're not they're self-referential. I'm not saying that they're necessarily immoral or wrong in why they choose to believe something, but it's for their own benefit and what they can gain from the thing. The whys are very, very different, and symptoms do not describe etiology. But yet, when you're dealing with the INFJ, they mean it as a mode of explanation for the nature of reality and why things move and how things ought to move and act in the world itself. That's very different. That's very, very, very different. And it's the case that they're just like that. It's the case that most introverted intuitive types are like that, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. Necessarily, it certainly does have its problems and leads them to a goddamn totalitarian monism, but that's neither here nor there. But that's also because of how extroverted feeling influences the INFJ. But either way, it's the case that extroverted intuition is skeptical. That's the fundamental philosophical skepticism is the flavor of its nature. And metaphysical empiricism is the nature of introverted intuition. And it's the case that it's archetypal in nature, and it's more concerned about the numinous and the anthropomorphic and archetypal elements of reality than extroverted intuition is ever going to necessarily be. But it's not the case that an extroverted intuitive can be interested in those types of things. It's just the case that that's not the why and the narrative that they're naturally disposed to construe about the world if they're not taught it or they're influenced in some way to see things that way. But anyway, that's my video on the nature of the two intuitions. Hopefully you found this informative and interesting. Thank you for watching.